Alright, so today's daf is Tzadi Aleph, but we're going to start with the new parak, which is at the bottom of Tzadi Amud Bet Hamatzniya. So again, it's continuing with the somewhat technical area of Hotza'ah, carrying on Shabbat and transporting articles from one place to another. What is considered a significant article is the big question that's occupied many of these Mishnayot and a lot of these Dapim. The scenario is if somebody were to carry an item out on Shabbat inadvertently, we want to know, did he transfer an object of significant that is significant enough to be considered a real melacha, and therefore he would have to bring if we lived in the times of the Beit HaMikdash, he would have to bring a korban chatat, or not. Obviously, the other application is, would he be liable for violating Shabbat on purpose? But usually we don't deal with those issues. We are more favorable and charitable and assume that it's all by accident. So the Mishnah says, "Hamatzniya lezera ul dugma urfuah." So a person who set aside an item either for zera, meaning he put aside a seed to plant it, uladugma, or for a sample. In other words, he's going to carry this item out as a sample to sell it. So these are situations in which you're carrying less than you normally would. So if you're carrying, for instance, seeds out to eat them, nobody is going to carry one seed. That doesn't really give you much. You're going to carry an amount that's more significant than that. But if you're carrying it out to plant it, so then that's a different story. If you're carrying it out as a sample to show somebody what kind of seeds you're selling, or l'refuah, sometimes for healing purposes, you're going to carry a smaller amount of something. And they're talking mainly about types of healing that we would consider segulot, kinds of healing that are sort of homeopathic kinds of remedies that they would use. So they wouldn't necessarily, they might involve foodstuffs, but they're not going to involve large quantities of foodstuffs. It might be one small piece of something that you hang on your arm or you put on your forehead or whatever it is. So since it's a smaller amount, since the purpose, the function that you're saving it for requires a smaller amount, therefore we don't apply the standard amounts to these items. So what Rashi says here is, B'chol echad shiura miforash lo. He's going to explain that each one has a shiura miforash lo. Each one has a measurement which is already explained with reference to it, which is the objective measurement. But if you, in your case, are saving it for some purpose that requires less, that would make a subjective measurement that's valuable to you. So even if you brought the tiniest amount, if that tiny amount is significant to you because of whatever purpose you are saving this for, then that's significant to you. But any other person who carries out this item is only going to be liable if it's the measurement which is the objective measurement, because that individual wasn't saving the item for any other purpose. Chazar v'chniso, if a person goes back and says, you know what, I was saving this item for I was saving one seed to plant my beans, to plant in my garden. But you know what? I decided I'm going to eat it. I'm going to put it back with the food. So now it reverts back to following the same objective measurement that it would be following before. And generally what we say is the size of a fig is the size of the amount of food which is considered significant. So seeds, the size, a quantity of seeds that's the volume of one fig would be considered a significant quantity, as opposed to you were deciding to plant 2 seeds or 1 seed. So in that case we would apply a different standard to you, but then you went back and you said, you know what, I don't want to plant this seed, I decided I want to save it for food. So now it goes back to being measured by the standard that it was measured by before.
Question about the fig.
Yeah.
If he decided to plant from the fig, how do you plant from the fig?
The seed. Oh, I don't know how do you plant a fig? I don't even know. I've never planted one. But it's not using a fig as an example of something you plant. It's using a fig as an example of how much. So if you wanted to know, let's say, how much hummus is significant, so the volume of a fig, whatever that volume is, so now you measure the amount of hummus that would be the same volume as a fig. Grogeret is a fig.
You can have grogeret of apples.
Right, of anything, of any food. Hummus, I used hummus because
it's only one
That's the amount, right?
Only
That's
one?
the amount, yeah.
So
let's.
bulgarian of apple, it's only one?
It could be less than one apple.
So
It could be a piece of an apple.
So
It's like a vibe or size.
when they
Right.
dry the figs, you have,
Yeah.
few of them on a...
Right. So one fig is considered significant. Now let's say I want to know.
Bulgarian, it's one.
It's one fig. So that means anything that's the same volume as that. Let's say it's not an ounce, but let's say it were an ounce. If we translated it into today's measurement, it would be a certain volume. It would be a certain volume. They just used foods because that was easier. They were around. People could find a fig and measure how much. So like Rashi says here, "Ela kashiru b'chol echad shiur mefurash lo b'zeronin chamisha." So we had said in previous Mishnayot for each of these items, certain beans, 2 is considered significant. Certain seeds, 5 are considered significant. Wine, we already said it had a certain measurement and so on. But once you say, you know what? It's true that seeds in general, 2 seeds is considered, or 5 seeds are considered significant, but I'm going to plant this and I want 1 seed. I want to plant 1 seed, so it becomes significant for you. However, if somebody else takes out that 1 seed, we wouldn't apply to them the standard that you created. And you can reverse it. You can say, you know what, I decided now I want to put that seed back with the food and I'm going to eat it. And that would be okay too. So now the Gemara asks, Lama le'le mitnei hamatzniah? Why does it talk about the person setting aside this item for a specific purpose? For example, saying that I'm going to set aside a very small amount of, let's say, apple to show people what good apples I have that I sell. So I'm going to put a tiny amount of apple just to show them how nice my apple is.
Well, the question they have
So
is
it's dugma.
a minute amount. In other words, why?
A minute amount. But why does it use the term hamatzniah? Why does it mention that the person put it away? Really, it should say, right? Litnei, it should say hamotzi. If somebody takes out a tiny amount of apple or seeds or whatever, or cloth or anything for either planting purposes or example purposes, advertising, I guess you could say, or for healing purposes, it's not the matzniah. It's not the fact that you set it aside for this purpose that makes you liable for violating Shabbat. It's the fact that you carried it out with that intention. True, but the point is that even if you were to, there doesn't have to be like a pre-existent designation, like you sat down and you said, I hereby declare that this item is going to be a sample. If you picked it up and said, you know what, I'm going to take this as a sample, that's also good. And you walked out with it to be a sample.
Right, but that's what makes it carrying on Shabbos.
Right, but it doesn't have to say hamatzniah, because hamatzniah means like you put it away for that purpose. Why do we have to mention that you put it away for that purpose? So the Amar Abayabai says, what are we talking about over here? Because let's say a person takes a seed, and they say, this 1 seed, I know it's not significant for food, but this 1 seed, I'm going to plant it in the backyard. And he puts it in the cupboard. And then comes back a week or 2 later and he says, I can't remember why I put that seed there. I'm just going to put it in my pocket and carry it out with me. He forgot that he had put it aside for planting. He didn't redesignate it for something else, but he forgot that he had originally designated it for planting. So in that case, and now he's walking out with it. Sitama, he's walking out with it with no particular intention in mind. You might think that because he forgot the original designation that he gave to that thing, therefore it no longer is considered significant. But the answer is kamashmalan, that whatever he does is going by the original intention. So in other words, there are 3 different scenarios. One scenario is where you walk out knowing this item is a sample item. I'm carrying it on purpose to be a sample. The other situation is, or I'm carrying it on purpose because I want to be able to plant it. Another circumstance is where the person set it aside for planting purposes or sample purposes and forgot why he originally set it aside separately from everything else and ends up carrying it out. So we don't say, well, since you forgot that you had put it aside for a sample, we're not going to apply that very strict standard anymore. Or since you forgot that you put the seed aside in order to plant it, which would make the standard much stricter, since you forgot, you're not basing yourself on that standard anymore. So we should apply the more liberal standard and say, well, if there wasn't enough for it to be food, then it won't count. So therefore, the Mishnah has to tell you hamatzniah, that once you've set it aside for that purpose, unless you explicitly revert it back to its original purpose, you're stuck with it. That's what Abai says. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel. Rav Yehuda said that Shmuel said, "Mechayev haya Rabbi Meir af b'motzi chita achat nizriah." That Rabbi Meir used to say that even if you took one wheat kernel out to plant it, that's significant enough to be chilul Shabbat. So pshita, that's obvious. Kol shehu tanan. It says in our Mishnah, Kol shehu, that even the smallest amount is significant if you set it aside for planting. So why are you telling me one wheat kernel? That should be obvious. So ma'u detema. Why does Rav Yehuda have to say, or why did Shmuel originally have to make this clarification? What does it add? Because you might say, because you might have thought that why does it say kol shehu in the Mishnah? It doesn't literally mean the smallest amount. Kol shehu literally means the smallest amount, but that's just a figure of speech. Really, really it has to still be at least an olive's worth. Kol shehu is too small. A tiny, minuscule amount is too small. So what was the Mishnah telling you? That it doesn't have to be the size of a fig. The size of a fig is bigger. But the size of an olive, it still has to be. In other words, you still might think that it goes by some minimum measurement that's more significant than minuscule. Okay? So therefore, kamashmalan, it comes to tell you that in fact, it's literally so. That even the tiniest amount is significant. Once you attribute significance to it, it becomes significant, and you don't need a kazayit, you don't need an olive's worth, you don't need a fig's worth, you don't need any of the typical measurements that we invoke in halacha. Matkifla Rav Yitzchak Bered Rav Yehuda, Rav Yitzchak Bered Rav Yehuda, the son of Rav Yehuda, objected Ela me'ata, according to that Chishev lo tzik kol beto hachinami de lo mechayev adim apik likulei. Well, why don't we do what we call reductio ad absurdum? We will take this argument and we will deduce something from it which is absurd. What is that? Well, what if a person said, I want to take all my belongings out of the house, all of them. So therefore, we'll use, and he only took half of them out. So are you going to tell me that he didn't transgress? He didn't do the Masekhet Hotza'ah because he decided? You're telling me subjective can do anything, right? Subjectively, I can make one wheat kernel significant. One seed can become significant subjectively. So what if subjectively I decide to expand the measurement? And I tell you that subjectively, I say that I am not done until my entire house is out on the lawn. All my possessions. So therefore, when I've only brought out 90% of the items into the public domain, you're going to tell me that it's nothing because subjectively I said that only 100% is significant. Is that like, let's say I'm moving or something like that, so I want to move all the stuff. I don't want only 90%. So would you tell me that so too I can apply the same argument and say that I'm going to ignore the objective shi'ur and I'm not going to use any objective measurement? So the Gemara answers no. Hatam batla da'ato etzel kol adam. Over there, his intent is batel. His intent is nullified by everyone else's. Meaning, when we establish objective measurements, we're establishing the typical objective view. You can be more stringent than that view, but you can't be more lenient than that view. In other words, right. So once you pass the objective measurement, that's it. We're not going to say, well, for you, only, it's like a person, let's say on Yom Kippur, there's an amount that you can eat. Let's say a person comes in and they're 1,000 pounds. So if they eat the amount that is the objective measurement for violating Yom Kippur, they're not going to feel a thing. They're going to be more starving than you are, even though they ate on Yom Kippur. So you're going to say they didn't eat on Yom Kippur? Of course they did. So there's an objective measurement that once you pass the objective measurement, you passed it. So it could be that for that individual, subjectively, it's not enough. But we say, batla dato etzel kol adam, that his intent or his mindset is nullified by the average, by the typical. He can be more stringent and say that for me, even this tiny amount is significant. But he can't be more lenient and say that what everyone, in other words, that's really the difference. In other words, when he says this one wheat kernel is significant, he's saying, I know it's not significant for you, but this is significant for me. Okay, so I'm adding something. But he can't say what's significant for everyone is not significant for me. He can't reject what everyone else has established as significant. He can add on and say this tiny amount is significant for me. But he can't reject what everybody else has established. That's what it means. Therefore, his intent cannot override the view of everybody else.
Why not say that with a minute amount, the main difference between the minute amount and the large amount is because the minute amount you're more likely to just forget and carry it, whereas there's no way that you're going to forget and carry
a gigantic amount. Well, because it's not an issue of forgetting or not. It's really just an issue of significance. So yeah, that wouldn't necessarily come in. So matnitin delok Rabbi Shimon. So yeah, that's basically it, right? So v'chol adamin chayavin alav ela kashiuro. So everybody else somebody might come to my house and see my little wheat kernel, and I was planning on planting that wheat kernel to make my very own wheat stock, so I just wanted to plant one of them. Or I bought corn and I wanted to pop most of the corn, but there was one little corn I wanted to plant and grow some more corn. So somebody comes to my house and they put that corn in their pocket and they walk out with it. So for that person, that's not a significant amount, that one corn. So the Gemara says, "Matnitin delak Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar." Our Mishnah is not following Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. We encountered him earlier in the Masechet. The Tanya said in the Baraita, "Kalal Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar," as it said in the Baraita that we learned earlier. Kol she'eno kasher, or actually it was even in a Mishnah, if I'm not mistaken, that Kol she'eno kasher lahatzniya ve'in matzniin kamahu v'uchshar lazeh v'tzni'o ba'acher v'otzi nitchayev zeh b'machashavto shel zeh. That according to Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, there was a general principle that anybody who sets something aside for a specific purpose that increases its stringency, in other words, that lowers the minimum amount and makes it even more strict, and someone else comes and we gave the example several weeks ago of the feather, of Matthias's feather. Okay, right. That for him, he loves his feather. So, but if you carried out his feather, it wouldn't be significant to you. However, according to Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, once Matthias makes this feather significant, then anybody in the world who carries it has to treat it with that same significance because he gave it significance. That's what Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says. But our Mishnah rejects that idea. Our Mishnah says that no, somebody else's subjective intention is not going to make that object significant for you. It only makes it significant for them. Amar Rava says, Amar Rav Nachman, that Rav Nachman said, Hotzi kegro geret lachila. These are those great cases where they bring these complex permutations and circumstances that you have to figure out how to apply the halakha. So he says, let's say the person carries out a grogeret lachila. He took out a fig's worth of food, of seeds, let's say. He has some seeds. He took them out for eating, and it was the minimum amount. It was a fig's volume. However, v'nimlach alei lazri'ah. But then he picked up these seeds inside. And remember, in order to violate the melacha of hotza'ah, of carrying, you have to pick something up in one domain. That's akira, and you have to transfer it and put it down in the new domain, that's hanacha. So when the person picked up the zra'im, he picked up these seeds, he was thinking, I'm going to eat these seeds. But then he's walking outside and he says, you know what, I'm going to plant these seeds, I'm not going to eat them. So he changed his intention midstream. Inami, alternatively, lazri'ah, he was carrying the minimum amount that would have been significant even for eating, but his purpose was to plant them. V'nimlach alei la'achila. But then he decided, you know what? I've decided I'm going to eat them. So chayav. Even though he changed his purpose in the middle, he's still liable for carrying. So in other words, he picked it up with one intention, but since the minimum amount stayed the same, in other words, the amount he was carrying out was the amount that would have been significant either way. It would have been significant for planting, it would have been significant for eating. So the fact that he started out wanting to eat it and then switched to planting, or he started out wanting to plant, then he switched to eating, doesn't matter. It's still going to be a significant act. But why would you think otherwise? So we'll see. So
it's type of chumrah. In other words,
right.
If he changes it for something smaller.
Well, we'll see. We're going to see that. So hold on to that one. Hold on to that. We're not there yet. Yeah. So pshita, this should be obvious. Zil ha'chayika shura. So why does Rava even have to tell us this? Isn't it obvious? Who cares why he carried the minimum amount that was good for anything? So why do we care that he changed his intention? So ma'udetema ba'enan akira v'anacha b'chadam ha'chashava v'haleka kamashmalan, because you might have thought that, you know what, you need to have the same attitude from beginning to end. So what's the thought here? The thought here is like this: that even though when you picked it up, you had a minimum amount in your hand that would have been significant no matter what your purpose was, whether your purpose was eating or your purpose was planting. The fact is that when you switch your machshava, when you switch your intention, you switch the framework. So actually, the minimum amount that would be applicable changed. So even though you had an amount that it was irrelevant to you, because you had an amount that would meet both standards, the reality is that the minimum amount that applied to you changed, because if you picked it up with having in mind that you wanted to eat it, then the fact that you had a fig's volume in your hand was very important. So then when you walked out and you wanted to put it down and you're thinking, I want to use this for planting now, how much do you actually need? Much less. Let's say only 5 seeds. Okay? But still, or even less than that. But let's say 5 seeds. So that's what Rashi uses as the example. So you don't need it to be a fig's volume anymore. So it happens to be that you have a fig's volume. But the fact is that you changed frameworks. Each framework has its own minimum measurement. So even though you happen to have an amount in your hand that would meet either standard, the reality is that the standard that applied to you changed. It either went up or it went down. If when you were leaving the house you had in mind to plant, so therefore all you really needed for your act to be significant was 5 seeds. But you happened to carry out a fig's worth of seeds anyway for planting, because you were going to plant even more. So it's true that it doesn't really matter. That amount would have been significant either way, but when you change your intention now that, no, I'm going to eat them, you just increased the standard. You met the standard, but you increased the standard on yourself. So it's as if, it's like when we talked about things combining. Do things combine if they have different measurements? So your action actually is subject to 2 different measurements. It just happens to be that the amount that you had satisfied both requirements.
So let's say the other way. If the minimum standard for planting seeds is
5 seeds or 5 seeds, we'll say. Right.
And you walk out with 10 seeds, but that's still not a fig's worth. You're walking out with the intent, you pick it up with the intention you're going to take it out and plant it.
Right. And now you decide to eat it.
You're going to eat it. So
right.
So you haven't met the.
So that's a different case that's going to come. Oh. We're going to see that case.
Because this case doesn't seem to make a difference.
Right. The change is only theoretical in this case, basically, right? So the first case that is the simplest case is where the change is totally in abstract. Nothing actually changed that would be relevant to the situation and practically. Okay. Right. Right.
You can be chayav chatzi chatat.
No. So, but that's the issue. In other words, does that theoretical change have an influence, even though there's no practical implication? And Rava is saying, no, it doesn't. Okay? So, ba'e Rava, but now Rava asks the following question. That, hotzi chatzi grogeret lazri'ah. This is your case. He took out half a fig's worth for the purpose of planting. But so when he left, he only had enough that would have been significant for planting. It would not have been significant for eating. But look what happened. V'tafcha, somehow it expanded to the size of a volume of let's say it must have been really humid or something. Okay, somehow it expands to the size of a fig's worth. V'nimlach alei al-achila, and then he says, you know what? I have a fig's worth. I'm going to eat it. So when he left, with the amount that he had when he left home, it wouldn't have been enough for eating. It would have only been significant if it was for planting. But by the time he comes to his destination and he wants to put it down, there's enough for eating and he wants to eat it. So when he left, he had the minimum amount that he needed for his act to be significant because he was thinking of planting, and he had less than a fig's worth. Now that he arrives at his destination, it's somehow expanded to the volume of a fig's worth, and he wants to use it for food now. So when he puts it down for food, he also has the minimum amount that's necessary for eating.
That's not my example.
I know, your example was even easier. Your example was even easier because in your case, when he gets to his destination and decides to eat it, he no longer has the amount that would have been good for eating.
But it's okay to eat it then.
It would be okay, but he wouldn't have been considered. It wouldn't have been considered carrying, because when he ended off his action,
that's my point.
Right. So he's taking an even further step. In other words, the answer to your question is implicit in this question, because he's going even further. He's dealing with a case where you had when you left home, you were thinking of planting, and you had the minimum amount of planting, but not for eating. And when you got to your destination, you wanted to eat, and you had the minimum amount for eating. And then he's saying it's a question. If you decided to eat and you didn't have the minimum amount for eating, you certainly wouldn't be good, right? So he says, okay. So Mahu im timtza lamar. You might come along and say hatam hu demechayev dezil hachav ikashira v'zil hacha ikashira, because in the first case you had a fig's worth. So no matter what your intention was, you meet the standard. But hacha kevan debeidna de'apkal lahava be'shir achila lo mechayev, or dilma kevan de'ilu ishtik v'lo hashiv ale mechayev amachashava dezri'ah hashtanami mechayev. It says that in the first case it's different. In this case, look at this case. When you started out, right? When you started out, you had the minimum amount for planting, and you left the house, and you come to your destination. Now, if you had stopped at that moment and hadn't said anything, would you have violated the prohibition of carrying? Yes, because your purpose was to plant, and you had the minimum amount for planting. Right. So the only problem was that when you get to your destination, all of a sudden you changed your mind. And you decided you wanted to do, and it expanded to the measurement that was good for eating, and you decided you wanted to eat it. Now, had you said nothing, would the fact that it expanded to the size of a fig have changed your liability? No, because it's an increase, right? Because planting it's more than the minimum amount, so it would have been fine. So had you said nothing, and you all of a sudden expanded to a fig's worth, and you had continued with your original intention, you would have been just as liable. On the other hand, if you had changed to wanting to eat it before it expanded, and you had carried it out with the intent of wanting to eat it from the beginning, in other words, if your final intention had been your intention when you left home, then you definitely wouldn't be liable. Because when you left home, you didn't have the amount that was necessary for eating. So therefore, it's a lot more complicated. Ve'im timtza lomar, and if you're going to tell me that you're going to tell me that since when you left, if nothing had changed in your intention, you would have been liable because when you left you had enough for planting and you were intending to plant. And all that happened was an increase, not a decrease. So nothing untoward happened, basically. It doesn't affect your original intention. It doesn't make it any less than your original intention. And the fact that it expanded doesn't ruin your original intention. And the fact that you want to eat it now doesn't ruin your original intention. Maybe you'll tell me. Okay, so what about this case, though? He says, Hashtanami Mechayev, so Hotike Grogeret Lachila. Let's say you walked out with a fig's worth. And you were intending, you had a fig's worth of seeds, and you said, I want to eat these. Utzmaka. And they contracted to less than a fig's worth. So now you have a big problem. Right? And then v'nimlach alei al-zri'ah. And now you say, you know what, I have less than a fig's worth. You know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to plant it. I'm going to plant it. So, Mao, what are you going to do now? Because in this case, if he hadn't said anything, in other words, if he had started out wanting to eat this item, and there was enough when he left, but somehow it disintegrated, and when he came to put it down, it wasn't enough. So what would we say? We would say he's not liable. Because what he put down was not enough for eating, and his intent was for eating. The only problem is he messed up by deciding he was going to plant it now, and lowered the standard. Okay, Odilma, right, made it more stringent, right? Odilma batar hashta az linanu mechayev, or maybe we say, you know what? When he left the house, he had enough to make his act significant, and when he arrived at the destination, since he changed his purpose, that was significant too. Because for his new purpose, it's all significant,
thinking,
right? Right. So
that makes it significant, even though from the beginning it might not have.
Right. The beginning was significant in that framework, and the end is significant in a new framework. So maybe we can combine it. So ve'im timtza lomar, maybe you're going to say batar hashtaz linan the stringent way, or mechayev, and therefore, since when he left the house, he had enough for intention number one, and when he gets to his destination and he changes and he decides he's a farmer today, and he has enough for number two. Even though it's shrunk down so that intention number one is no longer valid, but intention number two saves it, basically, and it redeems it in a bad way because it makes it a violation of Shabbat, but it redeems the action and keeps it significant because it's significant in a different framework. Right. But now we say, let's say you walked out thinking, I'm going to eat this delicious amount of seeds and I have exactly a fig's worth of seeds. Utzmaka, and somehow it shrivels up and it becomes less than a grogeret, it's less than a fig. But then miraculously, v'chazra v'tafcha, and now it expands again. How does this happen? We don't know, but it's just a theoretical, we don't care, it's a hypothetical case, okay? Mo, yesh dichoy le'inyan Shabbat, or ein dichoy le'inyan Shabbat, teku. Yeah,
Very
could
long
happen.
walk.
Yeah. So what happens? Yeah. So yeah, long walk basically. Yeah. So what happens? So what? Right. So what's the point? The point is now in this last case, the view never changes. In other words, the intention never changes. The beginning you had the right amount. The end you had the right amount. You never changed purposes. In the middle, you lost. You lost your minimum amount, but it came back so that the beginning had the minimum amount and the end had the minimum amount. He said, on that question, tekel, we don't know. Now, there's a general interpretive, two different schools of interpretation. Whenever we have these interesting sort of series of, and if you say the answer to question number 1 is B, what about question number 2? And if you say the answer to question number 2 is option B, what about question number 3? And if you say the answer to question number 3 is B, what do you say to question number 4, and so on? So there are two different ways of looking at the conclusion is tekel, we don't know. So does that tekel apply to all the questions? It's telling us, you know what? We don't know the answer to any of them. We're not sure. Or does im timtza lomar mean, you know what? We're going to decide in each case like the latter option, but the last question we don't know the answer.
It's not,
right?
We don't know nothing.
Right, so do we not know anything, or do we just not know the answer to the last question? Now you could see that next to the second option on each one of these questions is a small letter that says, look at the Rambam, and this is how it's codified in the Mishneh Torah. So actually the Rambam codifies according to the second option in each one of these questions, and the last one is teku. The last one is where it's a safek and we don't know. So he interprets that only the last question is left fully unresolved. If the following question: if a person threw a kazayit of tirumah, so tirumah is the food that is only allowed to be eaten by a kohen, and it has to be kept pure, and the minimum amount of tirumah that is significant is kazayit, right? Not grogeret. Grogeret is larger. A fig is bigger than an olive. So he says, you threw from obviously a public domain into a private domain, and he threw this terumah into a tameh domain, a tameh house. Let's say the house has tzara'at or whatever. So the question is, Mahu. So the Gemara says, Mahu what? What are you asking? Hilchot Shabbat, Hilchot Tumah, what are you asking here? Ila inyan Tumah. So, ila inyan Shabbat. If you're asking me a question about Shabbat, whether this throwing is considered transferring the object from a public to private, so then, kegrogeret ba'inan, we need the size of a fig, not the size of an olive. An olive is not enough. Ila inyan Tumah. If you're asking about Tumah, kabetza ochalin ba'inan. You need at least an egg's worth to be mekabel tum'ah. So why are you asking me about a kazayit, about an olive's worth? Le'olam le'inyan Shabbat. Really, what we're dealing with is Shabbat, Hilchot Shabbat. And what Rava wanted to know was, if I throw my kazayit of terumah into this house that's tameh, is it considered a significant act regarding Shabbat? Okay. However, the case is ukigon deika pachot mikabetza ochalin v'ai mashlimo lebetza. What happened was there was less than an egg's worth of food already in the house, and you threw in just a little bit more, another kazayit, and your throwing completed the kabetza. You completed the egg's worth. So let's say there was a little bit of food inside the house. It wasn't enough to be mikabel tum'ah because it wasn't an egg's worth. You threw in this one more olive's worth and completed the egg's worth. And now, with your addition, you made it significant with regard to the laws of tum'ah. Now, what you threw...
Combined?
Yeah. So no. So the question is like this. So my mitzaref inyan tumah mechayev nami inyan Shabbat udil kol inyan Shabbat kigrogeret ba'inan. So do we say like this? True, throwing a kazayit of food normally is not significant enough for Shabbat. It has to be a fig's worth. But in this case, when your kazayit lands, it combines with the rest of this food to create an entity of an egg's worth that is significant with regard to the laws of Tum'ah. So perhaps we should say that since your throwing acquires significance in a different halachic framework, in other words, in the halachic framework strictly of Hilchot Shabbat, it would have to be a fig's worth. But since in the halachic framework of Tum'ah, this is going to be a significant action, this transfer is a significant transfer. because it's going to create an entity that is mekabel tum'ah. Therefore, we attribute significance to your action as a result. That's exactly what it says. So do we say that since from the laws of tum'ah, this action is a significant action, so too for the laws of Shabbat? Or do we say no, the laws of Shabbat are independent, and if this doesn't meet the requirements for the laws of Shabbat, in other words, if it doesn't have a fig's worth from beginning to end, then we don't even look at it. That's the question. So Amar Le said to him, Tanitua, we already learned the answer to this. How so? Because Abba Shaul says, Shetei Alechem, the 2 loaves of Shavuot that are brought Velechem Apanim, and the showbread that's brought on Shabbat, Shiuran kegrogeret. The measurement is a grogeret. In other words, how much of this would you have to carry out on Shabbat to be liable? You'd have to carry out a grogeret's worth, a fig's worth of either the Shtei HaLechem, the 2 loaves of Shavuot, or of the Lechem Apanim, the showbread of Shabbat. So even though they're very significant. So Va'amai, Lema, maybe you should say, Mid le'inyan yotze bakazait, le'inyan Shabbat nami bakazait. You're telling me that you're considering the possibility that anything that's significant in a different halachic framework is also going to be significant when it comes to carrying. And it does make sense, because think about it. We use all these other totally subjective measurements. So why can't, so why can't another halachic significance be significant, right? So he says, so with regard to yotzeh, if something leaves the precincts of the Beit HaMikdash, for example, the Shetei Alechem, or if it leaves the precincts of the Beit HaMikdash, it becomes pasul. It's called pasul yotzeh, the invalidation of leaving the precincts of the Beit HaMikdash, or leaving the precincts of where it's allowed to be eaten. Okay, if it departs from there, it becomes pasul. So, how much has to leave?
Are you still trying to clarify the previous thing?
Yeah.
So where does the teku? It means
no. Where's the different?
It means like,
no, that was the previous question. This is a new question. This question is if you throw a kazayit and it combines with the food in the tamei house.
Okay, but it sounds like they're trying to clarify the previous.
No, the previous one is done. The previous one we left.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So now we're on this issue of, does something that's halachically significant, forget about your subjective significance or your purpose, whether you want it for eating or, right, we're talking about halachic significance. So in a halachic world, this kazayit is significant, even though in the Shabbat world it's not. So now, so the analogy is, if I take a kazayit's worth of korban, or I take a kazayit's worth of lechem apanim, or the breads of Shavuot out of the Beit HaMikdash, only a kazayit's worth is enough for that to be halachically significant. It's going to be pasul because it departed from the Beit HaMikdash. Okay? Since it's going to create a halachic invalidation by taking it out of the Beit HaMikdash, I should say, well then therefore, carrying a kazayit out should be significant. But yet, what did Abba Shaul say? No, unless you carry a fig's worth out, even though you're dealing with kodashim, even though you're dealing with the lechem apanim, you're dealing with the showbread, or you're dealing with the bread of Shavuot, still the measurement that's considered significant for carrying on Shabbat is a fig's worth and not an olive's worth. Even though, right, so halachic significance obviously doesn't have an impact, because halachic significance applies even to a kazayit, and we're not applying halachic significance here. So the Gemara says that is a bad analogy. Why? How can you make such a comparison? Once you walk out of the actual precincts of the azara, of the courtyard of the Beit HaMikdash, where you're allowed to eat these items, they become pasul. But Shabbat lo mechayev ademapik le'lereshut harabim. But when it comes to Shabbat, you have to actually go to the public domain before you violate Shabbat. So hacha Shabbat v'tum'ah bahadeh hadadeh ka'atyan. So Rava says, in my case, the violation of Shabbat and the tum'ah significance occur at the same time. Because when that kazayit that I threw into the house lands and combines with the other food, at that very moment, that's when it becomes tameh, and that's when the question of Shabbat would be a question, because that's when it's come to rest. So for purposes of Shabbat, that's when the issue would be raised. Here, when you walk out of the courtyard of the Beit HaMikdash, you already made this pasul. And what's the measurement for becoming pasul? A kazayit. Now when you walk completely out of the Har HaBayit, out of all the walls around the Beit HaMikdash, right? That's a second action. So now I'm going to look at that second action and ask, how much do you have to carry? Oh, there it's a fig. There's a fig size. It's two different things. So you can't really use that analogy. And actually, the Gemara doesn't go back to resolve this and leaves it as is. So now,
We're always dealing with negative things. Averas, like taking out of the place of Echila, or taking Metami Turma. These are Averas. We do talk about a mitzvah. Let's say Erev Pesach, Shechal Yom Shabbat. And Etzim, it's to get rid of the chametz, it's like a kazayat.
right.
And
True.
The kazayat is the minimum with Yeraisa. You're not supposed to have in your house a certain amount, and then when you do it on Shabbat, it would. That's a
very good point. That's also a prohibition, but that's a very good point. Why? Right? What?
It's a positive way.
Because you have to get it out. Yeah. But that's a very good point. Actually, he's raising. You could say, well, what on Pesach? A kazayit of chametz is very significant. So maybe less than even a mashehu is significant, actually, a tiny amount.
No, it's not only that.
Because it's not batel. Halachically,
taking it out, you're actually doing a vera, but also.
That's true. It's mitzvah ba'ba vera, right? True, but what if I guess you might say that the taking out is part of is a mitzvah there. But I was thinking even further than that. That's an example where there's halachic significance given to that item, even though it's less than a grogeret. Like you're saying, it's true that would be more complicated because biur chametz on Shabbat is more complicated. But yeah, you're right. It's another case where you could have a less than a grogeret that's significant. Yeah, where the measure of kazayit would give an object importance. That's a very good point. Now, chazar. So now we say chazar v'chniso eno chayav el kashiuro. We said that once the person reverts and says, "Listen, I don't want these seeds for planting anymore. I want them for eating," so it goes back to its original status. So pshita, this should be obvious. Amar Abaye says, "Hachabe mayaskinan." What are we talking about here? Kagon shizirakol otzar komonikar. It's talking about a case that this should be obvious because since it's subjective, if I change my mind, I change my mind. So Abaye says it's like if you take these seeds and you throw them back with the other food, but it's still discernible that they're apart from the other food. So you might say, since it's still discernible, because the way that you placed it, they're still apart from the other food, they still retain their significance. So he says, no, that you might have thought, that since the person put it back with all the other foods, even though you can still discern, oh yeah, these were the seeds that I originally had designated for planting and I put them back, still, since you put them back, that's enough of a change. It doesn't matter that they stand a little bit apart from the other ones and they're recognizable. The fact that you put them back with the food means that they're food again. Now the new Mishnah says, that if a person takes food out of the house and he puts it on the threshold. We learned about this earlier in the Masekhet. Because if you put them on this threshold, which we're going to discuss in the Gemara what exactly kind of threshold this is, whether you now pick it up and put it in the public domain, or someone else comes and picks it up and puts it in the public domain, it's not a violation of Shabbat because the melacha was not done in one fell swoop. Kupashim perot. If you had a basket full of fruit, untana ala iskopa achitzona, and you put it on the outer threshold so that it's hanging over and it's partially resting on the public domain. So in that case, afal pisherov perot mibachutz, even though the majority of the fruit that's in the basket is actually in the public domain right now, it doesn't matter. Patur achiotziet kol hakupa. Unless you move the entire basket into the public domain, you're still exempt. So it could very well be that the majority is in the public domain, but until the entire basket is transferred, it's not considered to be complete. So now the Gemara asks the same question that it asked earlier in the Masechet as follows. Hi, iskopa mai. What is this threshold? Ilema, if you're going to tell me iskopa reshut rabim, that it's a public domain, patur, how could he be exempt? Hakama pikmi reshut yachid reshut rabim. The case is that you took from the house and you put it on this iskopa. So if this thing is a public domain, obviously that wouldn't be an exemption. That would be the malacha. You just brought it from the house into the public domain. El iskopa reshut yachid. If you're going to tell me that it's a private domain, ben shechazar v'otzio ben sheotzio otzian acher, patur hakama pikmi reshut yachid reshut rabim. On the other hand, if you're going to tell me that this threshold is a private domain, then how can you carry from it to the public domain? And you told me that if somebody picks it up off of this threshold and puts it in the public domain, that it's not a violation of Shabbat. So it can't be a public domain because it tells us that moving it from the house onto it is not a biblical violation, and it can't be a private domain because it said that moving it from this into a public domain is not a biblical violation. Rather, ella iskupa karmelit, like we said earlier in the Masechet, that this threshold is a karmelit. It is neither a public domain nor a private domain. It's a domain which is rabbinically given stringencies of both public and private, because actually biblically it's considered nothing. And it comes to tell you tamad denach bekarmelit, halo nach bekarmelit mechayev. And what is the Mishnah coming to tell you? That the only time you're going to be exempt is when it rested in the Carmelit. In other words, if you carry, let's say, right in front of your house is a Carmelit, is an area that's neither public nor private. And you carry, like let's say for example, you come out of your house and right in front of your house you have a front yard. So the front yard is neither a public domain because it's not for public use, nor is it a private domain because it's not walled, and you walk into it. You carry something through your front yard into the street, which is a public domain. So you never put it down in the Carmelit. You didn't put it down in the quasi area. You picked it up in the private domain and you put it down in the public domain. You never put it down anywhere else in between. So what we see from there is even though you pass through the airspace of a domain which is neither public nor private, it doesn't cancel out your action. Right, because you never put it down. If you put it down in that front yard, and then you picked it up out of the front yard, put it in the public domain, so you did two rabbinical violations, because you're not allowed to carry from the private into the Carmelit, and you're not allowed to carry from the Carmelit into the public. But you didn't do a biblical violation. But if you...
So that means that you actually made a biblical violation by taking it from the private domain and putting it on the threshold of the... That separates the Carmelit from the private domain?
The Carmelit is in between the private and the public.
Right, so by putting it on the threshold, you
canceled out your biblical violation because you interrupted it. Because you didn't carry right from the private to the public. You put it down in between.
So you didn't do anything, in other words.
Right, you didn't do anything.
So
but if you simply carried through that area, the fact that you carried through that area doesn't cancel it. In other words, if you take something from your house, you walk through your front yard and you put it down in the street, but you never put it down in the front yard. The case of the Mishnah is, you took something from your house, you put it down on the threshold, which is like your front yard. Then you picked it up out of the threshold and you put it down in the public domain. So you never did one action of carrying from the private to the public domain.
Okay, and you're not chayav.
And you're not chayav.
You're chayav. So
but if you picked up in the private domain and you put down in the public domain and you just passed through that front yard, which is neither public nor private fully, that fact that you passed through the airspace of that area doesn't undermine your biblical violation, basically.
But that's not what the Mishnah said.
Exactly. The Mishnah is telling you that the way that in a case where you put it down in that place,
right,
you're not chayav. Implying that if you didn't put it down, you would be. Okay? So, and why is it telling you that? Because matnitin de lo ke ben azai. Because this is a contradiction to ben azai. The Tanya, as we learned in a Braita, hamotim echanut leplatia derech setav. Because he said if you take from the store to the platia is the plaza. In other words, you took from the store, which is a private domain, into the plaza, which is a public domain, through stav, through a Carmelit, through a place which is neither public nor private. Okay, so then he says patur, right? That you're going to be exempt. But the rabbis say chayav, right? So the rabbis say chayav. Ben Azai poter. Ben Azai says you're patur. Why? Because according to him, walking through it is like it came to rest. So unless you transferred directly from a private to a public domain with nothing in between, Ben Azai is going to say it's like it rested in that Carmelit and it cancels out your action.
Going to the airspace.
Right. The Chachamim say no, walking through an area is not, because Ben Azai says that walking through a place is like you stood there, it's like it rested there. The Chachamim don't buy that. They say walking through it
because you touched it.
Because you touched it with your feet. Right, it's like quasi-resting. Right, so therefore it breaks up the action according to Ben Azai unless you walked right from a private domain into a public domain. Like you walked from your apartment building out right into Fifth Avenue, I don't know, whatever, in New York City or something like that. Right. So that would be an example, as opposed to having a front yard in front of you. So that's why our Mishnah comes to tell us we don't follow Ben Azai, and we don't say that simply walking through a Carmelit is going to cancel your action unless you put it down. So now we get to this case of the Kupashim Milea. You have the basket full of fruits, and it's mostly resting in the public domain, but not completely. So Amar Chizkiah said, Lo shanu ela bekupa melea kishuinu dluin, aval melea chardal hayav. That Chizkiah says, this is only talking about a basket full of large fruits, so that not one of the fruits inside the basket is fully in the public domain. Because they're so big that even though the majority of the basket is resting in the public domain, you took it from the private domain and you put it down, resting 90% in the public domain. Okay, so since it's full of gourds and full of large vegetables, there's no one vegetable that's actually landed now in the public domain. But if it were full of seeds, and I put a basket of seeds down where 90% of the basket is in the public domain and part of it is still in the private domain, are we going to say that nothing has moved into the public domain? No, there are plenty of seeds that have completely moved now. The whole left side of the basket, let's say, has completely moved. All the seeds that are to the left of the basket have completely moved into the public domain. He says that is not what we're talking about in the Mishnah. There you would be liable for moving those seeds. Alma kasavar eged keli lasheme eged. What that means is, eged keli, the unification of the vessel is not unification. In other words, what that means to say is, you might think that what the Mishnah is telling you is that this basket is all one entity. I don't care what's in it. And therefore, since only 90% of it is leaning into the public domain, the fact that a tiny amount is still in the private domain means that it's not in the public domain yet. And I don't care what's in there. So Chizkiah is saying that's not true. Chizkiah is saying that's not true. If what's in there, if a full entity of whatever's in there has crossed over already, it's crossed over. We don't care that it's in a basket.
Why can't you have large fruits and part of it is...
Well, he's just giving an example. He's giving an example. Yeah.
So the reason why kupa is not actually that it rests on it, but it's a dividing.
It's a dividing place, right? For Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yochanan says no. Even if it's full of mustard seeds, you'd still be patur. Alma kasavar eged kelishime eged, because he says that once you put something in a container, we look at the container as the entity, and we don't care that the contents of what's inside have moved. So even though everything, the whole left and middle of that container have crossed over, whatever the contents are of that container have crossed over to the public domain, the fact that the entire container has not moved means that it hasn't moved yet. And we don't care that it's mustard seed, and therefore the many mustard seeds have now been transferred to the public domain, because we look at the container as the new entity. We don't look at the inside of the container with an X-ray like they do at the airport. That's the way Chizkiah is looking at it. Chizkiah is looking at, he says, I don't care about container, I care about what's inside. So if what's inside is now in the public domain, then I don't care that the container is still resting partially not in the public domain. Rabbi Yochanan says, no, once it's in a container, the container is the entity now. Okay, so now the Gemara says, and this is the last point, and we'll take up the rest of it tomorrow because it goes on to another discussion after this that's connected, but we're not going to be able to resolve it today. But the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Zera says, Matnitin Chizkiah dika, or Rabbi Yochanan dika. Our Mishnah doesn't really support either view. It doesn't fit well with either view. Why? So Chizkiah lo daika, it doesn't follow Chizkiah. Why not? Because it says Achiotzet kol kupa. Because it says that this basket is not considered to have been transferred to the public domain until the entire basket is moved. Tama de kola kupa. What does it say? The entire basket. Ha kola perot patur, implying that even if the entire contents of the basket have all shifted to the left, and they're all in the public domain, since the basket is still in the private domain in part, we don't care that the contents have all shifted over to the public domain. That's what the Mishnah sounds like it's saying. That contradicts Chizkiah, because Chizkiah is saying we do look at the contents. Alma kasavar eged kili sheme eged. So that would imply that we look at the container, not the contents. But similarly, it doesn't really follow Rabbi Yochanan. Why not? Tamadrov perot, hakol perot, afal gavda gida kupa migavae chayav. Because what does the Mishnah say? Even though most of the contents have moved into the public domain, it's still considered to be in the private domain. Implying, if all the contents had moved over to the public domain, in other words, if the entirety of one of the contents had moved over,
that's what
right? Yeah, the entirety of one of the entities, okay, had moved over. So then it would be considered a transfer. So alma kazavar eged kalil hasheme eged. So that implies that we don't look at the container; we look at the contents. So it's really a difficulty no matter what, because actually the Mishnah is contradicting itself. I mean, which one does it care about, the container or the contents? Because it mentions the contents and it mentions the container. Which is the defining one? So Chizkiah mitaretz tamei, both will since this Mishnah requires interpretation because it doesn't fit smoothly with either way. So each one has a license now to poetically, has some poetic license here to interpret the Mishnah in his own way, because it doesn't really fit smoothly or compellingly with either way. So Chizkiah is going to interpret it his way. Rabbi Yochanan mitaretz l'tamei. Chizkiah mitaretz l'tamei. What's Chizkiah going to say? Ad she'yotzi et kol hakupa. When it says until the entire basket is moved into the public domain, nothing has happened yet. Meaning we look at the container. So that I'll say that it's true that we do look at the container when the container is filled with long items that fill the entire length of the container. But if it were filled with smaller items, we would look at the contents and the location of the individual contents, and we wouldn't look at the container as a whole. That's all. Rabbi Yochanan mitaretz l'tamei. And how's Rabbi Yochanan going to get out of the problem? Afal pi sherov perot b'chutz v'lo rov perot bilvad ela afilu kol perot patur ad sheyotzi et kol hakupa. He's going to say that yes, it says even though the majority of the fruits are moved, but really it means even if all the fruits are moved, because the container is still situated in part in the private domain. It's using most as a euphemism for all, meaning even if all of them were all the contents shifted to one side, and if you looked at Google Maps, it would show you that those contents are all in the public domain. The fact is that they're in a container, and the container is situated in part in the private domain, so therefore it hasn't moved yet. And that's how we're going to interpret the Mishnah, that when it says most, it means all as well. That even if all of them have moved over to the to the other domain, the fact that the container is still in the in domain, the original domain, means that it hasn't moved yet.
And all here means all the contents of the container rather than all of one of the pieces.
How would you even
it doesn't matter.
Determine that?
It doesn't matter. In other words, according to Chizkiah, each item inside the container is looked at independently. We don't care as long as one item, even one seed, has completely moved over. That's it. Rabbi Yochanan doesn't care even if all the contents moved over. It's the whole container, right? So now the Gemara just
one of the possibilities, though.
Right.
Yeah, but the answer is there is no one answer in it.
Right. Right, so now here's the one last objection we're going to do for today. So Meitive, they've raised an objection. Hamotzi kupat harochalin ve'untana ala iskupa hachitzona. That if you took the basket that we talked about yesterday, also that was carried by the people selling spices and perfumes and things like that, and they have all different items inside their basket. So afal pi sherov minin b'chutz patur ad sheyotzi et kol hakupa. It says even if so he puts it on a place where the majority of it now is resting in the public domain, but some of it is still on this threshold, so it hasn't transferred over yet. So he says even if most of the items inside are over the line and they're in the public domain, unless the entire container is moved, it's still considered to have stayed in place. So the Gemara asks, so kasal kadatach, we're assuming bitzrare, that we're talking about bundled spices, and it's a problem because it means that even though most of the bundles have moved over to the public domain, it's still considered to be in the original domain. But according to Chizkiah, we should look at each bundle as an independent thing. And if most of the bundles have moved over, and that was how they used to carry it in little bundles, then that's a contradiction to Chizkiah. So Amar la Chizkiah will tell you, what are we talking about over here? That this is a person who sold very long items in his basket, so they were laid out lengthwise. And these long items and roots and plants. And so therefore, when it says the majority, it means the majority, yes, might have been crossed over of each one. But each one of those entities inside is still partially in the original domain. And therefore, has not made the jump over to the new domain yet. And we cannot say it's been completely transferred. And until the thing has been completely transferred, we're not going to consider the melacha to have been completed. And we'll continue here tomorrow with a comparison or a proof from the case of stealing and geneva, and the difference between what's considered a transfer with respect to Shabbat and what's considered a transfer with respect to stealing. When are you considered a thief? At what point in the process are you technically considered to have stolen an item? So we're going to learn about that tomorrow.